saw a familiar face walking on the avenue. Both surprised by the way we looked. The years had changed us too. We smiled and both embraced.
Hello again. Welcome to another episode of Gung HO. It's August 13, 2018. Have a guest here. He's been on before, Jeff Sussman. He's an author. He loves boxing, so he writes about boxing, but somewhere along the line, we decided to do a show, or maybe more, about our dads, our fathers. So we're going to tell you a little bit about ourselves, and then we're going to talk about our dad and how each one had an effect on our lives, I guess.
Absolutely.
So tell me a little bit about you.
Well, I was very close to my father growing up, and my father was the one who taught me how to box. He had been an amateur boxer, and after he taught me the elements of boxing, he signed me up for 10 boxing lessons at Stillman's Gym in Manhattan on 49th Street and 8th Avenue. I got 10 lessons for $100, and it was a middleweight fighter who gave me the lessons. I can't remember his full name. His first name was Nick. And my father knew Lou Stillman, who owned Stillman's Gym. And when I finished my lessons, I got a Stillman's Gym T-shirt, which I wore until it wore out. And that's how I became involved and fell in love with boxing.
Did your dad like to go to the fights?
We used to watch the fights on television. They used to be on a Friday night of fights on television. And when I was, I guess, maybe starting when I was about 10 years old, we started watching the fights on Friday night together.
Now, the same thing happened with me. My dad was an amateur fighter. In the Army, he was undefeated. He also was a street fighter. And he was a really tough guy, really tough. And he taught me how to box when I was really young. I started maybe about 5 years old. And he was involved in the boxing business a little bit. He had a nephew that was a professional fighter, and my father was helping him. I think he wasn't training him, but he was managing. So my dad brought me around to all the gyms, like 5 years old.
Right.
So I was going around with him and meeting all the fighters that we would see on TV.
Sure.
On the Gillette Cavalcade of Sports.
Right.
And then after that, we would go to the drive-ins to watch, we watched Rocky Graziano fight, we watched Sugar Ray Robinson fight, we watched Carmen Basilio. He was really a fight buff. He loved to fight.
Yeah, my father loved the fights and instilled in me a love of it as well. Yeah. It was interesting because my father died when he was a young man. He was only 45, and so there was a lot about him I never got to learn. And about 10 years ago, I visited his only surviving brother, who was 90, in Florida. And I wanted to know more about my father. And he told me that when they were in high school, there was a pro-Nazi movement. There were a lot of German immigrants in the neighborhood that my father grew up in Queens. And he said every day after school, my father got into a fist fight. Every single day almost after school. And he said it was like someone turned a switch on him, that once he started fighting, he couldn't stop. And he said even if he was losing, he couldn't stop fighting. You had to pull him off.
Well, my dad lived in Crown Heights, and there were a lot of blacks around then. So he had a reputation to fight with anybody, a lot of blacks, and he never lost a fight. I mean, he was something. All right. My dad was very patriotic, and he wound up serving twice, once during the Depression, came out, and then he went back in during World War II. And in fact, my mom was pregnant with me while he was at, I think, Fort Sill. Fort Sill. Yeah, he was He was in the 9th Armored Division. His patch is over here, if you could see it. I don't know. Yeah, there it is. That's one of the things he left me, 9th Armored Division. Your dad was...
My dad was drafted into the 8th Air Force, and he trained in a military base in, what was it, in Texas. And my mother's brother, who was training to be a fighter pilot, was in the same base. And one night they went out to a bar in this small town in Texas, and the local Texans didn't like these boys from the Northeast, and they got, according to my uncle, they got into a tremendous brawl, and the military police had to be called eventually to break it up, and from there, I heard another story that during basic training, they had a drill instructor from I think it was South Carolina, and he hated Jews, he hated Italians, he hated Poles,
Hated blacks.
hated everyone, and one day he made them all go on a 5-mile hike with full packs and gas masks on in the summer in Texas when the temperature was like 105 or 110 degrees, and a number of the recruits passed out, and they were so angry at this guy that the following night, while this man was sitting on the toilet, someone rolled a hand grenade into the toilet and blew him up, and they never found out who did it.
Oh my God, that's called fragging.
Yeah.
That was, you know, there were a lot of fragging incidents in Vietnam.
Really?
Yeah, yeah. That's when the enlisted Marines or the NCOs decide they don't like what this officer is doing, and they wait for him, like he might go to the shitter,
Right.
and they roll a grenade under there.
Well, that's what happened to this drill instructor, drill sergeant. They did the same thing to him.
Boy, oh boy. All right. Why don't we show some photographs of your dad
Okay.
in the service?
Yeah, this is my father just before he was shipped off to England in the 8th Air Force. And he was stationed at an air base in East Anglia and they flew B-24 bombers over Germany every single night. And during this is a photograph of his bomber crew, and during the last flight of the war, he was bumped from this flight, and a major took his place, and it was the only plane that didn't return that night, and all the people over here perished in that flight. My father, who's over here, who's separated by the chimney from a stove, is the only one who survived that. And it was at the end of the war when the planes, they said they were having milk runs. No one was being shot down anymore. And this was the last flight of this combat mission. And that was the only plane that didn't return that night.
I think you told me the major just wanted to go on a combat mission.
He just wanted to be an observer because the plane had such a high safety record. The crew had such a high safety record that he felt perfectly safe and comfortable. And here's another photograph of the crew. And here's my father, but everyone else there.
Which one is your father?
Here, right over here.
Right in the middle.
Yeah. And that jacket that he's wearing, he brought that back after the war, and I was a little kid, and I would put on this heavy leather jacket which had like a lambskin a lining, and it came down to my knees, and unfortunately it got thrown out along with a lot of other World War II memorabilia.
Yeah. I'll show you now some photographs of my dad. Tell you what happened to him. Well, this is my dad on leave with my mom. You see he's got a big bandage, but he never made it overseas. He was a member of the 9th Armored Division. But when he was at Fort Sill, he was complaining about a toothache. This side and that. Yeah. And they had a term back then, they called it gold bricking, and they
Mhm.
were saying he was gold bricking.
Right,
And
I've heard that term.
They ignored him.
Right.
So the infection went from his tooth to his brain. And it got so bad that he was dying. And they actually sent a telegram to my mom and told her to come to Fort Sill because that's how bad he was.
Right.
Her father stopped her from going because he said it's better to lose one than two, because she was carrying me at the time.
Uh-huh.
So they gave him his last rites. How's that?
The flag just fell at the perfect
Yeah.
time.
They gave him his last rites, and he survived, but he was in a hospital for maybe 8-9 months, and maybe 8 or 9 brain operations. So he, during that time, he had lost his sight, he had lost his speech, he's lost his hearing, he couldn't walk, couldn't do anything,
Terrible.
and he recovered. So that's when this is him again. He's home on leave. You could see the patch on his arm.
Right.
Let's see what else we have here. This is him in the hospital out in Fort Sill. He said that the only reason he survived is because at that time the Army had a monopoly on good doctors. And they flew surgeons in from all over the country to operate on him.
Wonderful.
But he wound up with, you could see it, he wound up with, they took out part of his skull and never put it back.
So he could never fight again with that.
No. And again, this is, I don't know, it's my mom and me while my dad was in the Army. All right. And he was a really tough guy, and he was really patriotic. So what happened to your dad when he came home?
My dad came home, and he was very angry at what he had seen overseas, all the destruction, all the death, and so forth. And he. I remember my first memory of him is having breakfast in the kitchen, and there was a little bathroom off the kitchen, and he was shaving in there, and he cut himself accidentally, and I heard him curse, and that was the first thing that I remember about my father, his cursing about cutting himself.
Well, my dad, the first thing he did when he got out of the Army, he became a welder at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and then he did anything to make money. But he wound up being a barber. He wound up following his father, and actually his father had been born here. So I'm actually third generation on my dad's side. I'm not on my mom's side, because on my mom's side, her parents were both born in Italy. So, anyhow, he was very smart, and he decided to move us out of Brooklyn when I was about 6. He thought that being raised out on the island, I would and my sister would have a better chance of going to college, and he was right.
Good for him.
Absolutely right.
Yeah, my father's first job after the war, he became a salesman for a company called the United States Vitamin Corporation. It's the first company that manufactured vitamins in the United States. And his father was a little bit of a gambler, and won a small clothing factory in a poker game. And he died, my father's father died when he was 64 years old in 1947 or 48. And my father took over the clothing factory that his father had won in this poker game.
Was it in Queens?
Yes.
How did I know that?
And it was in South Ozone Park, Queens, and he expanded it. He made it very successful, and he had about by the time I was a teenager, he had about 60 employees, primarily a lot of women sewing dresses and so forth. And then he and his partner opened another factory with a third partner in Brooklyn. But I used to work for him on Saturday mornings. He was open for half a day on Saturday. And my job was, in addition to sweeping up and cleaning everything at the end of the day, my job was also carrying up these heavy bolts of cloth. They weighed about 50 or 60 pounds, big round bolts of cloth, from the basement to the cutter's table. And the cutter would, the table was 50 or 75 feet long, and the cutter would unravel these the bolts of cloth and then place a pattern on top of them and cut out dress patterns. I was there once when the cutter accidentally cut off his pinky, and we had to rush him to the hospital. But another time I was coming up the stairs with a bolt of cloth, and I heard my father yelling and screaming at some guy, and the guy was yelling and screaming at my father. And they almost came to blows. And before this other guy left, he pointed at my father and he said, "We're going to get you, you son of a bitch." And he left. And I didn't say anything then, but driving home from there, I asked my father what happened. And he said, he named a man who was a very famous gangster in New York at the time, who was a labor racketeer and operated in a legal union for the Teamsters, and had also, later on, it was proven that he had blinded a labor reporter for the New York Daily News named Victor Rizelli, threw acid in the man's face and blinded him. So my father said he wouldn't be surprised if bullets started coming through our living room window. And my father was a very good employer. He was very good to his employees. Unusual in the 1950s, he provided medical insurance for all of his employees. And this guy who wanted to unionize his workers wanted to take dues and everything else from them, and they would have gotten less take-home pay than my father was paying them. So they voted against the union. And he also wanted my father to hire his trucking company. And my father had a cousin who knew people in the mob, and he went to him, and this man was able to negotiate a deal where my father didn't have to have his workers unionized, but he had to use the trucking company, their trucking company. And my father died 2 years later, and his partner was a weak man, and as the gangsters kept raising the price of trucking, and his partner couldn't pay it, they took over pieces of the business. Until eventually they drove him out of business, and they took over the business. I don't know if that would have happened had my father been alive, because my father was willing to stand up to these people. Though his cousins said they would stop at nothing. They'll kill you, they'll kill your family, they'll kill your son. And I remember when we graduated from the 8th grade, before my father made this deal with them, we came home after a dinner out, and someone had broken into our house, and they destroyed everything in the kitchen. Food was smashed against the walls, and things were overturned and so forth. And I learned years later that this was a message. You better do what we say, or this is just the beginning of what's going to happen to you.
We're not going to get enough information or enough about our dads. We haven't got much time left, but you reminded me of something that happened to my dad. My dad, although he was a barber, he always owned his own place, and he always made a great living. And in fact, he did so good that he bought property and built more shores in Massapequa, and he had a contractor build a custom home for us. But later on, he moved back to Brooklyn, and he got involved with 3 other legitimate guys, and they built a nightclub. I was the lawyer that incorporated them. And everything was legit. They had a liquor license, and they opened up. It was in Bensonhurst. They opened it up, and it was an instant success. I mean, it was just like, this was like late 70s, early, maybe 76, 75. I had just gone out to practice on my own in 75. Well, all of a sudden, he was like pushed out, told to leave.
Who pushed him out?
Well, at first I didn't know. So, you know, I had some contacts myself, so I had someone go over there to find out what was going on, and he got back to me, and all he said to me is, there's someone there. So I went to some other people, and they, you know, they were from the Lucchese crime family, and they went over there, got back to me and said, yeah, there's someone there, Sal Gravano.
Sammy the Bull.
Yeah, and all we could do is get your father's money back out. That's it. You know, because this guy, Sammy Gravano, was a killer.
Sure.
So that's what happened. But the place was a gold mine for years, a cash cow for Sammy Gravano. And I think they named it the Plaza Suite. Instant success. My dad would have probably been a millionaire if the mob didn't step in. And tell you the truth, I was a lawyer at the time. I think I incorporated them in 1975. But if I wasn't a lawyer, I think I would have done something about it.
Well, I always had this revenge fantasy that I would have liked to have gone after the people who threatened my father.
Well, I would like to do that too. And believe me, I was an incredible shot. I mean, I could take a person out at 500 meters, hit him right in the head. That's how good I was, without a scope.
Really?
Yeah, I was very, very talented with a rifle. All right, so
How much more time do we have?
just about 4 minutes.
Okay, I just wanted to show you one other photo.
Oh, that's a great photo.
This is my mother and my father on a cruise to Havana, Cuba in the mid-1950s, around 1956. And my father liked to gamble. And they were at this famous gambling hotel in Cuba that was run by the mob. I think Meyer Lansky owned it. And my father, he was very brilliant at math. He could do all kinds of things in his head. It was just incredible what he could do mathematically. And he was winning a lot of money at the craps table, much too much money. And they came over to him and they said, it's time for you to leave. You better get out of here right now.
You know, my dad was, he was a straight guy, but he knew everybody. He didn't know Sammy Gravano, though. But he knew the mobsters, he knew the politicians, he knew everybody. And he was just a straight guy, tough guy. What happened to him, I guess, if there was some intervention early on, maybe that, you know, because I had very good connections with the Lucchese people. They might have been able to do something early on, but I didn't really know who was there. That's how tough it was.
Well, I was only, 12 or 13 when this happened to my father. I was in no position as a little kid to do anything.
I was in my early 30s, so. Anyhow, he never was in trouble with the law, although he had a partner that got indicted by the feds and went away for a while. But my dad never got in any trouble.
No, neither did my father. And
Yeah.
he also knew a lot of people in the mob, and he knew a lot of politicians. And I remember there was a congressman at the time that he was friendly with. His name was Congressman Holtzman. And he went to him to tell him about this mob attack. And the congressman was frightened of doing anything.
Actually, when they had my my mom had my graduation party in the, what was it? It was the Thomas Jefferson Democratic Club in Canarsie, because he knew everybody.
Right.
And so we had my graduation from college.
How funny.
And we didn't realize, though, that I'd be soon leaving. It's crazy. All right. You people out there, you hear me? We're going to have to do another show right now. Keep going. Okay? Yeah, my dad, in the end, turned out to be my best friend. That was one of the best things that happened to me while he was in his early 60s.
But even though my father died, I was 15, he was 45 when he died, he had an enormous influence on me.
Yeah.
And he was like a friend. He was a role model for me growing up. There were a couple of times when, I was angry at him because he could be so short-tempered and get angry. And he was very impatient.
We just ran out of time. Let me see.
Old time. Where have my old friends gone? Where are they now? It used to be a walk away in my hometown, but they're so far away, as far as walk can be. But in my heart they're close to. Yes, in my heart they're close to. In my heart they're close to me.